The frontier station called Wind 9 had watched the same empty patch of sky for 140 years, and in all that time, it had never once been surprised. That was the whole point of it. Wind 9 hung at the outer edge of the Concordance's mapped space, a lonely ring of sensor arrays and habitat spokes crewed by a rotating handful of the galaxy's more patient species, and its single job was to keep a ledger of everything that crossed the threshold between the known and the unknown. Comets, rogue planetoids, the slow, glittering caravans of the migrant Vashtiel. Nothing had ever come out of that dark that the station's instruments could not name within the hour. The Concordance liked it that way. Predictability was the closest thing the old Alliance had to a religion. So when the anomaly bloomed on the deep array at 03:11 station time, the duty officer, a mild-mannered Thren named Oskosk, assumed it was a fault. He ran the diagnostic. The array was healthy. He ran it again, still healthy. Then he looked, really looked, at the shape the sensors were straining to describe, and the 4 small hearts beating in his chest all skipped at once. Something was standing in the empty patch of sky. It had not flown in. There had been no approach vector, no relativistic bleed, no wake of displaced dust or bent light to mark a translation from faster-than-light travel. One instant the volume of space had been empty, catalogued, dead. The next it held 900,000 tons of metal shaped like a blade. Oskosk sounded the alarm that no one at Wind 9 had ever expected to use. Within the hour the station's small council had gathered in the observation blister, and within that hour the thing in the dark had done nothing at all. It simply held its position, motionless relative to the station, drifting on no current the instruments could find. It did not answer hails. It did not power weapons. It radiated a faint, steady warmth, far warmer than the void around it, as though it had come in from somewhere with a sun. "It is a ship," said the station's ranking scientist, a gray-shelled sea thari who had spent 2 centuries studying the physics of the deep. She said it the way a physician says a diagnosis she does not like. "An old one. The hull configuration is pre-concordance. Chemical rockets, fusion torch, a keel meant for planetary bombardment. This is a warship, and it is built by hands that have been dust for 200 years. "Whose hands?" Oskosk asked. The sea thari pulled the archive. It took the station's computers a long time to find the match, because the match came from a catalog that no one had opened in a very long while, a catalog of losses rather than discoveries. When the record finally surfaced, the name that came with it turned the observation blister very quiet. Terran Combat Vessel Perdita, commissioned in the 3rd decade of humanity's expansion. Complement 311, lost with all hands 217 years ago at the Battle of the Kale Drift, presumed destroyed. No wreckage recovered. No survivors. A monument to her stands on the human homeworld to this day. "Humans," said Oskosk, and there was in the word the particular unease that the older species of the Concordance always felt when the young, loud, impossible species came up. "Of course it is humans. It is always humans." Lieutenant Sela Marr was asleep in the acceleration couch of the courier cutter Meridian Lark when the priority tasking woke her, and she was very young to be the answer to a 200-year-old question. She was 26 standard years old, 3 years out of the academy, and she had drawn the Lark posting the way most junior officers drew their first commands, as the least glamorous berth the fleet had on offer. The Lark was a diplomatic courier, unarmed, fast, and small, and Sela's whole squadron of 1 existed to ferry documents and dignitaries between the human settlements strung along the Concordance frontier. She had never fired a weapon in anger. She had never seen a battle, or a wreck, or a body that had died in space. Her most dangerous posting to date had involved a malfunctioning coffee dispenser and a diplomat who had blamed her personally for it. She read the tasking 3 times before she believed it. Wind 9 was 4 hours away at the Lark's best burn. She was the nearest human vessel to the station by a margin of 2 full days. Every warship the fleet could spare was already turning toward the frontier, but they were days out, and the thing in the dark was here, now, warm and silent and impossible, and the Concordance Council was making noises about quarantine, about tugs, about towing the artifact somewhere it could be safely studied by people who were not human. The fleet did not want that. The Perdita was a human grave. Human hands would touch her first. So the fleet reached out and found the only human hands within reach, and they belonged to a 26-year-old courier pilot who had never touched a warship in her life. Her orders were narrow and very clear, and she disliked all of them. Proceed to Wind 9. Establish contact with the object if possible. Board if safe. Above all, establish and protect human custody of the vessel and any remains aboard until the fleet arrived. Do nothing to endanger the object, the station, or the fragile diplomatic arrangement that let humanity operate this far out at all. Do not, the orders said in language that had clearly been written by a nervous admiral, improvise. Sela Marr had a gift for improvisation. It was, in fact, the only thing her academy instructors had ever agreed she was good at. She suspected the admiral knew that, and had chosen the words as a kind of prayer. She brought the lark up to burn, and pointed its nose at the empty patch of sky. She saw the Perdita from 100 kilometers out, and the first thing she felt was not fear but a strange, aching tenderness, the feeling a person gets looking at an old photograph of someone long dead. The ship was beautiful in the brutal way of her age. She was a wedge 400 meters long, all armored prow and recessed gun batteries, and the great scorched bell of a fusion torch at her stern, a design from an era when humanity had still expected the stars to be hostile and had built accordingly. 2 centuries of drift should have left her a ruin, pitted by micrometeorites, her hull bleached and cratered, her running lights long dead. Sela had studied wrecks in the academy. She knew what 200 years in the deep did to metal. The Perdita did not look like a wreck. She looked like she had left dock yesterday. Her hull was whole. Her armor was smooth and dark and unscarred, save for one enormous wound along her port flank, a gash 40 meters long where something had once torn her nearly in half. But even the wound was wrong because it had healed. Sela could see the edges of it, where the ancient hull metal gave way to something else, something that had grown across the breach like scar tissue, a smooth silver-gray skin that flowed over the ruined armor and sealed it. She had never seen a material like it. Neither, when she queried, had the Lark's database, or the Concordance archive, or the panicked sci-fi scientist, who was by now patched into her comms and narrating her approach in a voice thin with wonder. The breach material is not in any catalog, the sci-fi said. It is not a metal. It is not a ceramic. Its atomic lattice is, Lieutenant, I do not have a word. It should not hold together. It should not exist at these temperatures. And it is warm. The entire ship is warm from within, and there is no reactor signature. There is no power source we can find, and yet that hull is radiating heat like a living thing. Maybe there's a survivor, Sela said. Somebody keeping the lights on. Lieutenant, the last human aboard that vessel died 217 years ago. Then somebody's keeping the lights on for a long time. She said it lightly, because the alternative was to say what she actually felt, which was that the ship in her forward window did not feel dead. It felt asleep. It felt, absurdly, tended, the way a house feels when someone has kept it warm and swept and waiting, though the person you came to see is nowhere in it. She brought the Lark in slow, matching the Perdita's non-existent drift, until the great dark wedge filled her window and blotted out the stars. Up close the wrongness only deepened. The healed breach glowed very faintly along its seams, a deep ember red, like a scar that had never quite finished cooling. And the warmth of the ship reached her instruments now as a steady pulse, slow and even once every 4 seconds, a rhythm so regular and so organic that Sela found her own breathing had fallen into step with it before she noticed. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. "It's breathing," she said, and did not know why she whispered. "That is not possible," said the Sithari, but she did not say it with any conviction, because she was watching the same telemetry, and the telemetry said what it said. The station council wanted her to wait. The fleet was 2 days out. Protocol said hold position, observe, do nothing until the professionals arrived with their containment rigs and their exobiology teams and their 2 centuries of caution. Sela listened to all of it with half an ear while she watched the ancient ship breathe, and she thought about the 311 names on the monument on Earth, the ones she had walked past 100 times as a cadet without ever reading, and she thought about how those names had waited 217 years for someone to come, and how the nearest someone was her. Then the Perdita answered. It was not a hail, not exactly. Her calm suite lit with a signal weak and ancient, a data format so old the Lark had to search its deep archive to decode it. When it resolved, it was not words. It was a beacon, the automated identification pulse that every human warship of that era had broadcast to friendly forces, the electronic equivalent of a raised hand. 2 centuries out of date, its encryption keys long expired, its call signs belonging to a fleet that no longer existed. But it was unmistakable, and it repeated, patient and clear, once every 4 seconds, in time with the ship's slow, warm breath. TCV Perdita, identity friendly, requesting DOCKING, SOULS aboard. Sela Marr read the last 2 words and felt the hair rise on her arms. Not souls lost, not remains, souls aboard, present tense. The ancient dead ship was telling her, in the formal grammar of a navy that had been gone for 200 years, that there was someone still alive inside. "Lieutenant," the Sithari said sharply. "Lieutenant, we do not know what that signal means. An automated system could hold that phrasing for centuries. It proves nothing. Wait for the fleet." Sela was already unstrapping. "Lieutenant Marr, I am ordering you to hold position." "You're a scientist," Sela said, not unkindly. "You can't order me anything, and with respect, ma'am, my orders say establish contact and board if safe." She looked at the great breathing wedge of the Perdita, at the ember glow of her impossible healed wound, and she made the decision that would define the rest of her short and suddenly enormous life. "It's asking to come home. 200 years, and it's still asking to come home. I'm not going to make it wait for a committee." "You do not know that anything aboard is alive." "No," Sela agreed, "but it says there are souls aboard. And if there's even one, then I'm the closest human being to it in the whole galaxy, and I'll be damned if the first face they see after 200 years is a stranger's." She pulled her suit seals tight and checked her helmet. "Tell the fleet I'm going aboard. Tell them I said the ship asked me to." She cut the comm before the Sithari could answer, because she did not want to hear the rest of the argument, and because her hands, she noticed, were shaking, and she did not want anyone to hear that in her voice. The Perdita had a docking collar on her dorsal spine, an old universal standard ring that predated the Concordance's docking protocols, but which the Lark, being a courier built to serve every scattered human outpost on the frontier, could still mate to. Sela flew the approach by hand. She did not trust the autopilot with something breathing. The collar took her ship's ring with a deep, resonant clang that she felt in her teeth, metal meeting metal across 2 centuries, and for a moment nothing happened. Then from somewhere deep inside the ancient hull, she heard machinery wake. Not the grinding of dead systems forced to move, but a smooth, oiled, cared-for turning, the sound of a mechanism that had been maintained. Pumps, valves, the distant sigh of atmosphere moving. The airlock indicator on the Perdita's side of the collar cycled from red through amber to a steady, welcoming green. The ship had pressurized the lock for her. The ship was expecting her. Sela Marr stood at the threshold between her small living ship and the great warm dead one, and she keyed the cycle, and the ancient door of the TCV Perdita opened for the first time in 217 years to let a human being come home. Warm air breathed out to meet her. It smelled of iron and ozone, and very faintly, impossibly, of coffee. The smell of coffee stopped Sela Marr cold in the airlock. It was such a small, human, impossible thing. A warship 2 centuries dead should smell of nothing, or of rot, or of the sterile chemical stink of a tomb that had preserved itself. It should not smell like a galley at the end of a long watch. She stood with one boot over the threshold and breathed it in through her open helmet, iron and ozone, and that faint dark warmth of roasted beans, and she felt the last of her certainties come loose. "Lark," she said quietly, for the record her suit was keeping, "atmosphere reads clean. Nitrogen-oxygen mix, standard human ratios, pressure nominal, temperature 20 degrees. Trace contaminants consistent with an occupied vessel." She swallowed. "I'm removing my helmet." She did it before she could talk herself out of it. The air was warm and moving. Stirred by ventilation she could hear humming in the walls, and it tasted of a ship that people lived in. She left her helmet clipped to her belt and stepped out of the lock into the Perdita, and the ship received her. The corridor beyond was lit. That was the first wrongness, and it was a gentle one. There was no obvious source for the light. The walls themselves gave it off, a soft, even glow the color of late afternoon, warm and shadowless, and when Sela put her gloved hand against the bulkhead, the surface was faintly warm and faintly alive with that same slow 4-second pulse she had felt from outside. The corridor was clean. The deck plating was worn in the center where 2 centuries of boots might have walked it, except that no boots had walked it in 2 centuries, and the brass fittings on the old bulkheads were polished bright, and there was not one mote of dust in the moving air. Someone maintained this ship. That thought would not leave her. Someone swept these decks and polished this brass and brewed that coffee, and the someone had been doing it for 217 years, and none of that was possible, and all of it was true. She walked forward. The corridor was an old warship's spine, running fore and aft, ribbed with pressure doors that stood open and welcoming. She passed a crew mess with tables bolted to the deck, and on one of them a mug. She stopped and looked at the mug for a long time. It was ceramic, chipped at the rim, and it was half full of coffee, and the coffee was warm. Steam rose off it in a thin curl into the light that came from nowhere. Beside it lay a folded playing card, a jack of spades, worn soft at the corners with handling. "Somebody was sitting here," she said, "just now. Somebody was sitting here drinking this." No one answered. The ship breathed around her in and out, 4 seconds each way. She keyed the ship's schematic from the wall panel, and it lit at her touch, an old amber diagram of decks and compartments, and here the wrongness stopped being gentle. The schematic showed her the Perdita as she had been built, 400 meters, 9 decks, a warship's clean, brutal geometry. But when Sela paced it, the geometry did not hold. She walked what the schematic said was a 30-meter corridor and counted her steps, and it took her 90 meters to reach the door at the end. She walked back, and it was 30 again. She went down a companionway that the diagram said dropped 1 deck and came out 3 decks lower, in a compartment that on the schematic was 400 meters away and 1 deck up. The inside of the Perdita was larger than the outside, much larger. The ship folded space around her the way a sleeping animal folds itself around warmth, and it did it so smoothly and so kindly that she was halfway through the impossible geography before her mind caught up and began, quietly, to scream. "Lark," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "Lark, are you receiving? The interior dimensions of this vessel do not match the exterior. I say again, the interior is larger than the exterior, substantially larger. I think I'm about 1 kilometer into a 400-meter ship, and I haven't reached the reactor spaces yet." Static answered her. The signal from the Lark had thinned to almost nothing, the way a voice thins across a great distance, though she had walked less than 1 kilometer and the ship was less than half that long. She was already too deep inside the folded space for the outside to reach her clearly. She stood alone in the warm, breathing corridor of a 200-year-old warship that was bigger on the inside, and she made herself keep walking, because the alternative was to stand still and be afraid, and she had decided a long time ago, without ever quite saying it to herself, that she would rather be foolish and moving than sensible, and stopped. She found the first log fragment in the compartment, where the corridor finally gave out. It was an officer's cabin, small and spare, and it had been lived in. A bunk with the blankets squared away, a rack of uniforms in a fabric no moth had ever touched, and on the fold-down desk an old data slate, the kind humanity had used 2 centuries ago, its screen dark. When Sela picked it up, it woke to her hand, and the log that filled it was written in the plain, flat prose of a naval officer keeping a record because regulations said she must. The first entries were ordinary. The Perdita, part of a task force, ordered to the Kale Drift to blunt an incursion the histories no longer remembered clearly. The name at the top of each entry, Commander Avenkojima, Executive Officer. The entries were terse and competent and full of the small business of a ship at war, watch rotations and gunnery drills and a quartermaster's feud over ration allotments, and Sela read them fast, her thumb flicking, because she could feel the thing coming that the whole ship had been built around. It came on the 9th entry. Battle of the Kale Drift, the log said. Day 1. And then in the same flat, competent hand that had complained about ration allotments, we are losing. The task force is gone. Anders is gone. Vashti is gone. The flag went up in the first hour and took Admiral Rourke and half the fleet with it. The Perdita is alone and holed through the port flank, and we have lost the torch and most of main power. Captain Odell has ordered us to run for the drift itself. Into the gravitational anomaly the fleet was sent to guard. The enemy will not follow us there. Nothing follows anything into the drift and comes back. She says a slim chance is better than none. She says we do not get to choose our odds, only whether we keep our heads while we play them. I have logged my formal objection. I have also plotted the course. Both things are true. We are going in. Sela sat down slowly on the squared-away bunk of a woman 2 centuries dead and read on. The entries after that grew strange, and then stranger, and the change was not in the events but in the time. Commander Kojima dated her entries by ship's clock, faithfully, day after day, and the days did not add up. Between one entry and the next she would note the passage of a single watch, 8 hours, and the ship's chronometer would show that 3 years had passed. She noted this herself, at first with an officer's alarm and later with an officer's grim acceptance. Time does not run true here, she wrote. We have measured it 40 ways and it lies every way we measure. The clocks disagree with each other. The clocks disagree with our own bodies. We have watched a full year cross the chronometer while the coffee in a mug stayed hot. Dr. Sway believes the drift is not a place, but as she uses a word I will not pretend to understand. A wound in the shape of the universe. We fell into it running from the enemy, and now we are trying to find the way out. And every time we think we have the way out is 3 years further away than it was. Then later, in a hand that had steadied into something Sela could only call peace. We have stopped counting the years. There is no point. We count the watches instead. We stand our watches and we keep the ship and we keep each other because that is the one thing in here that still runs true. Captain Odell says a crew is not a number of years served. A crew is a promise you keep to the person on the next watch. We are keeping it. We are all still keeping it. 311 souls went into the drift, and I mean to bring out everyone whose promise I can keep. The log ended there. Not because it stopped, Sela realized, turning the slate over in her hands, but because this was only one slate, one officer's record, and Commander Avenkojima had carried it in her cabin, and one day 200 years ago or 200 years from now, in the strange arithmetic of the drift, had set it down on this desk and walked out to stand another watch and never come back for it. Souls aboard, Sela said aloud to the empty cabin, to the breathing ship. You weren't lying. You've been in there the whole time. You've been in there keeping your watches. The ship pulsed warm around her, in and out, and she chose to believe it was an answer. She did not go straight to the forge, though something in the ship was already pulling her toward it. She went first, because she was an officer and an officer accounts for what she finds, through the compartments that opened off the folded corridors, and each one told her another piece of a story she was only beginning to believe. She found the bridge, or a bridge. The ship had more of them than it should, spaces where a crew had once stood watch, and this one was small and worn and lived in. The captain's chair was patched with the same silver-gray material that had healed the hull, its original leather long since worn through and mended by hands that had refused to let even a chair fall apart. The tactical displays were dark, but someone had pinned a child's drawing to the bulkhead beside the helm, a crayon sun over a crayon house, the paper soft and yellowed but whole, and Sela stood looking at it for a long time before she understood what it meant. Children. There had been children aboard. 217 years was longer than any human life, and the Perdita had gone into the dark with 311 adults and no future. And somewhere in the impossible arithmetic of the drift, the crew had decided, against all sense, to have one anyway. The drawing was proof. Somewhere on this ship, or somewhere in its long, strange history, a child had sat with crayons and drawn a house and a son it had never seen, because its parents had promised it that such things were real and waiting, and had needed that promise to be true. She found a schoolroom. She found a garden with a bench in it and 2 centuries of names scratched into the wood, some of them crossed through with the same careful grief she had seen in the chapel. She found a machine shop where the tools were not standard issue, but handmade, forged and shaped and balanced by people who had run out of spare parts a century ago and had simply started making their own, better ones, out of a metal that should not exist. She found, in a quiet compartment near the ship's heart, a wall of photographs, real printed photographs curling at the edges, hundreds of them, faces and faces and faces, weddings and birthdays and the small ordinary triumphs of people who had built an entire human life inside a dying warship in a wound in the universe, and had documented it faithfully, the way people do when they have decided that their lives matter and mean to leave a record even if no one ever comes. Someone had come, she was the someone. Sela Marr stood in front of the wall of 200 years of human faces and felt the enormity of it settle onto her, the sheer stubborn refusal of the thing, and she pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth and let herself weep, once, quietly, because she had promised herself she would not do it in the chapel and this was not the chapel, and because some things are too large to walk past without paying them the tribute of tears. Then she wiped her face and squared her shoulders, and did what the crew of the Perdita had done for 217 years. She kept going. She found the living crew by following the smell. Not the coffee this time. Something older and deeper, that had been threaded through the whole ship since she boarded and that she had not let herself name. The smell of a forge, hot metal, scorched air, the particular sharp mineral tang of something being made under enormous heat, and under it, so low it was more a pressure than a sound, a hum that she felt in the fillings of her teeth and the marrow of her bones, that slow 4-second pulse grown vast, the breathing of the whole ship gathered into one place. The corridors bent her toward it. She was sure of that now. The folded space of the Perdita was not random. It carried her the way a current carries a swimmer, gently, insistently, deeper and deeper into a ship that had become far larger than any ship had a right to be, past compartments she did not stop to understand. A hydroponics bay gone jungle thick and glowing with its own soft light, tended, harvested, alive. A workshop where tools hung in perfect order over a bench still warm from a hand. A chapel, of all things, small and plain, with 311 names carved into the bulkhead and small careful marks beside 140 of them. And Sela did not let herself count the marks because she already understood what they meant, and she could not afford to weep yet. And then the corridor opened all at once into a space that could not fit inside the ship, that could not fit inside a moon, and Sela Marr stopped at the edge of it with her breath torn out of her, because at the heart of the 200-year-old warship, cupped in a cradle of impossible silver-gray metal grown like living bone, burning steady and contained, and utterly, catastrophically, gloriously alive, there was a star. A small one, a handmade one, but a star, a true star, a sphere of fusing plasma the color of a forge's heart, hanging in the cathedral dark of a space that folded the universe around it, and it breathed, in and out, 4 seconds each way. And in its light, ranged around it on catwalks of grown silver metal, tending it the way shepherds tend a fire against the night, small and human, and impossibly, undeniably alive, stood the surviving crew of the Perdita. They turned, all of them, toward the young officer frozen in the doorway, and an old woman at the star's edge, her face lined and lit gold by the light of the thing her crew had forged to keep themselves alive, looked at Sela Marr with 2 centuries of waiting in her eyes and said, in plain human words, the first spoken to Sela since she came aboard, "You took your time getting here, Lieutenant. We kept the coffee hot." There were 31 of them. Sela counted twice, standing at the edge of the great folded space with the forged star breathing its gold light over all of them, because the number mattered and because counting gave her something to do with the part of her mind that wanted to break. 31 out of 311. She had seen the marks in the chapel, and she understood now what they were. Not casualties from a single battle, but a slow toll across an impossible span of years. And 31 was what was left, and 31 had held. They did not look like ghosts. That was the thing she would try later to explain to people who had not been there, and would always fail. They looked like a crew at the end of a very long watch. Their uniforms were old pattern but clean and mended, patched 100 times over with the same silver-gray material that had healed the ship's wound. Their faces were weathered in the way of people who have worked hard and long, but they were not old faces, not most of them, not the way 2 centuries should have made them old. Time had not run true here. It had scoured some of them and passed others by, so that a young man of perhaps 30 stood watch beside a woman who might have been 60, and both of them, the log had told her, had walked into the drift on the same day 217 years ago. The old woman at the star's edge came toward her across a catwalk of grown metal, unhurried, and Sela came down to meet her, and they stopped an arm's length apart in the light of the impossible sun. "Captain Odell," Sela said. It was not a question. She had read the name in the log, and she knew a captain when she stood in front of one, the way you know a keel by the ship built on it. "Ione Odell." The old woman's voice was dry and warm and steady, a voice that had given orders for 200 years and expected them followed. "Master and commander of this vessel, for my sins, and for a great deal longer than the commission intended. And you are the young officer the ship told me was coming." She looked Sela over, taking in the courier's flight suit, the single lieutenant's bar, the youth of her, and something moved in her weathered face that might have been amusement and might have been grief. "They sent a child." "They sent who was nearest," Sela said. "I'm Lieutenant Sela Marr, courier service. My ship's docked at your dorsal collar. Ma'am, I don't—" She stopped, because there were 1,000 questions and every one of them was inadequate, and the star breathed its gold light over the whole impossible scene, and finally she asked the only one that mattered, the small human one. "Are you all right? Is anyone hurt? Do you need help?" Captain Odell looked at her for a long moment, and then, to Sela's astonishment, the old woman's eyes filled and she laughed. A cracked, helpless laugh with 2 centuries of held breath in it. 217 years, Odell said, and the first thing the galaxy asks us is whether we need help. She wiped her eyes with the back of a scarred hand, unashamed. "Yes, Lieutenant Marr. Yes, we need help. But first, I think, you need to understand what you have walked into, because you cannot help us if you do not, and we have very little time to spend on wonder. Walk with me. Look at what my crew have made. And I will tell you what happened to us out there, and what it cost, and what we still have left to pay." They walked the catwalks around the forged star, and Captain Odell told the story, and the crew went on tending their son as she spoke, and Sela Marr's understanding of what human beings were capable of came apart and was rebuilt 3 sizes larger. "We ran into the drift to escape the enemy," Odell said, "and the log will have told you that much. What the log could not tell you, because Avon wrote it before we understood, is what the drift is. Dr. Sway called it a wound in the universe, and that is as good as any. It is a place where the laws thin out, where the rules that hold everywhere else grow soft and negotiable. We fell into it whole and dying, with the torch gone and main power failing, and by every law we carried in with us, we should have died in the dark within the month." "But the laws were soft," Sela said. "The laws were soft." Odell stopped and put a scarred hand on the railing and looked down into the forge light. Dr. Sway understood it first. She was a physicist before she was a naval officer, and she stood on this deck with the reactor cold and the air going stale, and she said, "I remember it exactly," she said. "Captain, in here, want is a force." We did not understand her. She said it again. "In the drift, the universe listens, not to wishes, not to prayer, to need. To a thing wanted hard enough and clearly enough and by enough people at once that it becomes," she said, "a boundary condition. A rule the softened universe will bend itself to satisfy, because in here the difference between what is and what is needed has grown thin." Sela looked at the star. "So you needed a sun." "We needed power, and we needed it forever, and we had no reactor and no fuel and no way home." Odell's mouth twisted. "So Sway and Chief Atero and 40 of my crew who had never studied physics in their lives stood in the dead reactor space for a year of ship's time, and they wanted a fire. They held the shape of it in their minds, all of them together, every watch, the way you hold a course. A contained fusion, a hearth. A star small enough to cup in a ship and steady enough to trust your children's lives to. They argued the shape of it. They corrected each other's understanding. They built it in their heads before they built it in the world, and then one day the drift gave it to them because they had needed it clearly enough and long enough and together enough, and it has burned ever since." She looked at Sela, and there was no madness in her eyes, only a terrible sane certainty. "That is what you are looking at, Lieutenant. Not a machine. A thing my crew wanted so hard, and so exactly and so much as one, that the universe agreed to let it be. They forged a star out of need and stubbornness and 2 centuries of refusing to die. And it is only the first of the things they made." She walked Sela through the rest of it, and each one was worse and better than the last. The hull that healed itself was not machinery. It was the ship's own will to be whole, given form in the softened space of the drift, a want made metal. The folded interior that made the Perdita larger inside than out was 31 people needing more room to live than a warship had been built to give them, and getting it. The air that stayed fresh, the coffee that stayed hot, the light that came from the walls, every impossibility Sela had walked past was the same impossibility wearing a different face. A human need, held clearly enough and long enough and together enough, in a place where need was a force, until the universe rounded up. "Dr. Sway had a phrase for it," Odell said. "She said we were not breaking the laws of physics. She said we were outvoting them. There are more of us who need the fire to burn than there are laws that say it cannot, so the fire burns." That was her joke at the end. That we had discovered democracy at the level of natural law, and that humans, being humans, had immediately used it to demand the one thing the universe was most reluctant to give. Which was? Captain Odell stopped at the highest catwalk, where the whole cathedral of the forge lay spread below them, 31 people small as sparks around their handmade sun, and she said the thing that the entire ship, Sela finally understood, had been built to want. To go home, that is the need under all the others, Lieutenant. The fire, the healing, the folded decks, the years of holding together, all of it, every impossible thing my crew forged in the dark, they forged in service of one want. To come home. To bring the crew of the Perdita out of the wound in the universe and back to a sky with Earth's sun in it, and to set every soul we had left down safe on solid ground under a real sky, and to keep the promise Avon wrote in her log. every soul we could. That is the boundary condition we have been holding for 217 years. That is the shape we have been wanting so hard the universe finally began to bend. She turned to Sela, and now the amusement was gone from her weathered face, and only the grief and the iron were left. And 3 days ago in drift time, we found the edge. We found the place where the wound thins back into ordinary space. We felt the laws stiffen around us, felt the softness going out of the universe, and we knew we had nearly made it. We pushed the ship at the gap with everything 31 people could want, and the Perdita broke through, and you saw us appear out of empty sky because there was no crossing. There was only inside and then, suddenly, out. Her hand tightened on the rail until the scars stood white. But we are not all the way out, Lieutenant Marr. That is what you have walked into. The ship is out. The hull is out. But the fire is not, and the folded space is not, and 31 souls are standing on catwalks that only exist because we are still wanting them to, in a piece of the drift we dragged out with us like a call. And now that we are in ordinary space, the laws are stiffening. The universe is remembering its rules, and every rule it remembers is a thing my crew has to hold up by hand. The star breathed, gold and steady, in and out, 4 seconds each way. But now that Sela knew to look for it, she could see what she had missed. At the top of each breath there was a flicker, a hesitation, a half-second where the light guttered like a candle in a draft before 31 exhausted people caught it and steadied it and made it burn on. "It's going out," Sela whispered. "It is going out," Captain Odell agreed. "Because the universe on this side does not believe in it, and there are billions of tons of ordinary law pressing in on us now. And 31 is not enough to outvote a whole galaxy that has remembered its own rules. We got the ship home, Lieutenant. We got the hull across the line. But the fire that keeps us alive and the space that holds us up were only ever real because enough of us needed them. And out here, one by one, we are losing the strength to need them hard enough." She looked at the young officer with 2 centuries of weariness and something that was almost, impossibly, hope. "We can hold a little longer, hours perhaps, not days. And so I will ask you the question the whole ship has been asking the dark for 200 years, and I will ask it of a 26-year-old courier pilot because you are the one who came." She drew herself up, master and commander of the Perdita, and asked it. "Will you help us the rest of the way home?" Sela Marr stood in the light of the forged star and understood, with the cold clarity that comes once or twice in a life, exactly what was being asked, and exactly how far out of her depth she was. She was a courier pilot. She flew documents and diplomats. She had no reactor engineering, no exotic physics, no fleet at her back for 2 days yet. The professionals who might understand this were days away, and the ship had hours. Every rule she had ever been taught said hold position, observe, wait for people who knew what they were doing. But the ship had hours, and the people who knew what they were doing had days, and the arithmetic of that was as simple and as brutal as the arithmetic of who had been nearest to Wind 9. There was no one else. There was only her. "I don't know anything about your fire," she said. "I don't know anything about wanting things into existence. I fly a courier. I'm not captain, I'm not who you needed. You needed a fleet. You needed physicists. You got me." "I know what I got," said Yoni Odell, and she said it gently. "And I have commanded human beings for 217 years, Lieutenant, in the worst place any human beings have ever been, and I have learned to see the one thing that matters about a person in the first minute I stand in front of them. Dr. Sway is dead. Chief Atero is dead. The physicists who forged the star are ashes in the chapel bulkhead. I do not need another physicist. The physics is done. The fire is lit. The want is held." She put her scarred hand on Sela's shoulder, and the grip was iron and warm. "What I need is one more person to want it with us, one more soul to hold the boundary. And the universe does not ask for your rank, or your training, or your qualifications, Lieutenant Marr. It asks only whether you need us home as badly as we do. So I will ask you plainly, And your answer is the only thing in this galaxy that matters right now. Do you? And Sela Marr, 26 years old, 3 years out of the academy, the least glamorous officer in the fleet, looked at 31 people who had held a promise together in the dark for 217 years, and she found that she did. They put her to work, because there was no time for anything else, and the work was the strangest thing Sela Marr had ever done. It had no controls. That was what undid her at first. She was a pilot. She understood the world through switches and throttles and the honest resistance of a machine that did or did not obey. But the crew of the Perdita led her out onto the catwalks around the forged star and gave her nothing to hold and nothing to turn. And a young man named Reyes, the 30-year-old who had walked into the drift the same day as the 60-year-old woman beside him, stood her at the star's edge and told her the only instruction there was. "Need it," he said. "That's the whole job. You look at the fire and you need it to keep burning the way you'd need a rope you were hanging from to hold. Not want, not hope, need. You put your whole weight on it. You let it be the thing between you and the dark because it is, and then you don't let go." He gave her a tired grin, and there was 200 years behind it, and the ease of a man who had been doing an impossible thing so long it had become ordinary. "You'll feel it when you've got it. It pulls back, like a current, like a hand closing on yours. Just don't let go, Lieutenant. Whatever you feel, whatever you see, don't let go. People who let go out here," the grin faltered. "That's how we got from 311 to 31. Not the battle, the letting go. 200 years is a long time to keep needing the same thing. Some of us got tired, so don't get tired. Or if you do, tell someone and we'll hold your part till you can take it back. That's the rule. That's the only rule. Nobody holds alone." Sela looked at the star, and she needed it to burn, and at first there was nothing, only a young woman staring at a fire and feeling foolish. And then, so gradually she could not have said when it began, there was something. A pull. A tension running from the center of her chest out toward the gold light, as though a line had been made fast between her sternum and the star, and on the far end of the line something was pulling back, patient and enormous, a current in a river she had not known she was standing in. She gasped. Beside her, Reyes nodded, satisfied. "There it is," he said. "Now your crew." She held it. Minutes passed, or hours. Time did not run true even here, even now, even at the ragged edge of the drift. She held the star the way she would have held a controlled descent. All her attention narrowed to the one thing, and around her the 31 did the same, and the fire burned. And at the top of each breath it guttered and hesitated, and they caught it together and it burned on. She began to understand the shape of the thing they had been doing for 2 centuries. It was not dramatic. It was not heroic in any way the histories would know how to write down. It was 31 people standing watch over a fire, refusing, minute by endless minute, to let it go out. It was the most ordinary thing in the world and the hardest, and they had been doing it for 217 years. And Sela Marr, holding her small part of it for 1 single hour, felt the weight of that time settle onto her like the weight of the sea onto a diver, and understood that it should have killed them all, and that the only reason it had not was that they had refused together to let it. "How," she said to Reyes, to Odell, to any of them, when the captain came to relieve her at the rail and put fresh hands on the boundary so Sela could rest. "How do you do this for 200 years? How do you not? How does anyone not let go?" Captain Odell looked at the fire her dead physicists had forged, and she answered slowly, because it was the question under the whole ship, and it deserved a slow answer. "You do not do it for 200 years, she said. "That is the trick of it, Lieutenant, the only trick we ever learned. No one can need a thing for 200 years. It is too big, it is too far. If I had asked my crew to hold this fire for 2 centuries, we would have lost it in the first month because the mind cannot grip a weight that size." She turned from the star to Sela. "So we do not hold it for 200 years. We hold it for 1 watch. 1 watch, that is all. 4 hours. Any soul aboard can need a fire to burn for 4 hours. And when the 4 hours are done, someone you trust comes and puts their hands where yours were, and you go and you sleep and you eat and you play a hand of cards, and you let go of the whole enormous impossible thing entirely, because it is not yours anymore, it is theirs and they have it. And then you come back and take it again. That is all a crew is, Lieutenant. It is not 300 people. It is not 200 years. It is one watch, kept and then handed on and then kept again, by people who have decided that the person on the next watch will not be let down. Avon wrote that in her log before she understood the physics. A crew is a promise you keep to the person on the next watch. She was more right than she knew. It turned out to be the physics too. Sela thought about that. 31 people who had reduced the unbearable to the bearable by refusing to carry more than a day of it at once, and by trusting, absolutely, that when they set it down someone else would pick it up. The forged star was not the miracle, she realized. The forged star was only what the miracle looked like from outside. The miracle was the handoff. The miracle was that in 217 years, through every death and every exhaustion and every soul that grew too tired and let go into the dark, there had always been someone to take the next watch. The promise had never once been dropped. 31 people were alive because the promise had never once been dropped. That's why the ship came back, Sela said slowly. You said the universe listens to need held together. It's not just that you needed to come home. It's that you never stopped keeping the promise long enough for the need to break. 200 years and you never dropped it, not once, not for one watch. So it held. So the fire held. So you're here. So we are here, Odell agreed. And now the last watch is the hardest one, because it is the one where the universe stops helping. Between the watches, in the hour, Odell forced her to rest. Sela sat with the crew of the Perdita in the mess where the coffee was always warm, and she learned who they were. They were not heroes. In any way they would have recognized the word. That was the thing that stayed with her. Ray's had been an ordinary rating, a loader on a gun crew, 30 years old on the day they went into the drift and 30 years old still, spared by the lying clocks for reasons no one understood. And he told her about it the way a man tells a story he has told 1,000 times, without self-pity, dealing cards as he spoke. The 60-year-old woman beside him was named Halloran, and she had been a cook, and she had aged the ordinary human way while Ray's had not, and the two of them had stood watches together across 2 centuries and become the closest thing either had to family, and neither could say why the drift had chosen to age one and spare the other, and both had long since stopped asking. There was a man named Petrov who had gone into the wound at 19 and had, by his own reckoning, lived 4 ordinary lifetimes since, and had buried more friends than most people ever have, and still laughed easily, still cheated at cards, still needed the fire to burn every watch he stood. There was a woman named Okonkwo who had been born aboard in the strange years, and had never once seen a real sky, and who told Sela, without bitterness, that she had needed the ship home her whole life for a sky she had only ever seen in a crayon drawing and her parents' promises. They played cards. That was what struck Sela hardest, harder than the star, harder than the folded space. 31 people at the end of the universe, holding a fire up with their bare minds, and in the hour they were off the watch they played cards and argued about the rules and accused each other of cheating and laughed. It was the most human thing she had ever seen, and she understood at last how they had survived. Not by grand endurance, not by heroism. By the small, deliberate ordinariness of a hand of cards and a warm mug and a friend who would take your watch when you were tired, repeated, faithfully, across 217 years, until the ordinary itself became the miracle. People think we must be very strong, Halloran said, watching Ray's deal, her old hands folded around a chipped mug. To do what we've done. They'll say it when we get home if we get home. That we were strong, that we were made of something they aren't. She shook her head slowly. We weren't. We aren't. We're a cook and a loader and a girl who was never young enough to see the sky. We got tired the same as anyone. We wanted to let go the same as anyone, and some of us did, and we don't judge them for it, God rest them. The only thing we did that was any different, she looked up at Sela, and her eyes were very clear, is that we never once let the person on the next watch come to an empty post. That's all. 200 years, and there was always somebody there when you handed off. Always. That's not strength, girl. That's just not letting each other down. Anyone can do that for one watch. We just did it for a lot of watches in a row. Sela thought about the child's drawing on the bridge, and the wall of 200 years of faces, and the marks beside 140 names in the chapel, and the coffee kept warm for a stranger who had taken 2 centuries to arrive. And she understood that she was sitting among the strongest people the human species had ever produced, and that not one of them would ever agree that they were strong at all, and that this, precisely this, was the strength. Then it was time to go back on the watch, and they got up, unhurried, and went, because someone was waiting to hand off to them, and no one was ever left at an empty post. The crisis came 4 hours after Sela boarded, and it came the way Odell had said it would, not as an explosion but as an ebbing. The Perdita, hull and all, hung in ordinary space, and ordinary space did not believe in her. Sela had felt it building the whole time she stood the watch, a pressure, a stiffening, the soft negotiable physics of the drift hardening back into the iron rules of the real universe now that the ship had crossed the line. Out here, want was not a force. Out here, a fire needed fuel, and a space needed room, and 31 people needing a star to burn counted for exactly nothing against the vast, indifferent arithmetic of natural law. The call of drift space they had dragged out with them was thinning, and as it thinned, the forged star began, at last, to die. It did not gutter and hesitate now. It shrank. Sela stood at the rail with the whole crew, every one of them on the boundary now, no one resting, all 31 hands on the fire, and she watched the star pull inward, its gold light reddening, its 4-second breath growing shallow and quick, and she felt through the line in her chest the terrible mounting strain as the universe leaned its whole weight against the thing they were holding up. "It's not enough," Reyes said through his teeth, and there was fear in his voice for the first time. "Captain, it's not enough. We're out of the drift. The rules are back. 31 can't outvote the whole of ordinary space. We got the ship home, and the ship's going to be our tomb after all, because we crossed the line and left the only place our fire could live." "Hold it," said Odell. "Hold it, all of you, hold the watch." "We're holding it and it's still dying," Reyes' voice cracked. "You can't need a fire hard enough when the universe itself is voting no. There's not enough of us. There were never going to be enough of us. We should have stayed in the drift where the fire could live. We should have." "No," said Sela Marr. She did not know she was going to say it until she had said it, and once she had said it, the whole shape of the thing fell into place in her mind, cold and clear and terrifying, the way the shape of a landing falls into place when the engine dies and there is only one field left to reach. "No," she said again, louder, and 31 exhausted faces turned toward the 26-year-old courier pilot at the rail. "You're doing the arithmetic wrong. You're counting the crew. 31 against the whole universe. Of course that's not enough. Of course you can't outvote ordinary space with 31 people. But the arithmetic isn't 31 anymore." She grabbed Odell's arm. "Captain, when I came aboard, when the ship broke through, the whole concordance saw it. Every sensor at Wen 9. There's a station out there full of people watching this ship, and behind them there's my fleet, 2 days out but coming, and behind them there's Earth. There's a monument on Earth with 311 names on it, and every human being who ever walked past it knows this ship is lost and wishes it wasn't. The whole species has been wanting you home for 200 years, Captain. They just didn't know you could hear them." Odell stared at her. "They are not in the drift, Lieutenant. Their want is not a force out here. Only ours, only those aboard. Only those aboard, because only those aboard know the fire is real and can need it clearly enough." Sela's mind was racing now. The improviser's gift her instructors had grudgingly admired running full out at last. seizing the one field left to reach. But that's a problem of knowing, not distance. Dr. Sway said the universe listens to need held clearly, by enough people, all at once. You've been 31 people holding it clearly for 200 years. But out here you don't need it held clearly anymore. Out here you need it held by enough. And there are trillions of us, Captain. There's a whole galaxy that would need this ship to make it home if they only understood that their needing could matter. She let go of Odell's arm and turned toward the great folded space, toward the dying star, and her voice rang out across the catwalks. You don't need 31 people to want it hard. You need 3 trillion people to want it at all. And I know how to reach them. My ship's docked at your spine, and it's a courier, and a courier's whole job is to carry a message to everyone at once. For one heartbeat, no one moved. Then Captain Ione Odell, master and commander of the Perdita, who had held a promise together in the dark for 217 years and had one watch left in her to keep, looked at the young officer the ship had brought her, and something broke open in her weathered face that was not grief at all. Sway, she breathed to the ghost of her dead physicist, to the fire her crew had forged, to the 2 centuries of dark behind her. Sway, you brilliant woman, you said it was democracy. You said we'd outvoted the laws. We never tried to bring in the rest of the electorate. She rounded on her crew, and her voice was a whipcrack, a captain's voice, the voice that had kept 31 souls alive across an impossible span of years. Hold the fire. All of you hold it, don't you dare let go. By this child every second she can get. Lieutenant Marr, she seized Sela and pointed her at the corridor that led back to the docked Lark, back up through the folded impossible decks to the small honest courier ship at the spine. Run. Get to your ship. Tell them. Tell the station, tell your fleet, tell Earth, tell every soul who can hear you what is aboard this ship and what it needs and why. And tell them the truth, Lieutenant, all of it. Because a lie will not carry the weight, and only the truth held clearly by enough of them can hold this fire up. Tell them the Perdita is home, and she is dying on the doorstep, and the only thing that can save her is for all of them, all at once, to need her to live. Sela was already running. The run back through the Perdita was a run through a ship coming apart at the seams of the impossible. The folded space was failing. Sela felt it the moment she left the forge, the great corridor that had carried her a kilometer into a 400-meter ship, snapping and shortening around her, as the universe remembered how long a warship was supposed to be. Compartments that had stood open and welcoming when she came aboard now sealed themselves as their extra room was reclaimed, the hydroponics jungle wilting to a single dead bay, the impossible geometry collapsing back toward the honest, brutal shape of the ship as designed. She ran through a chapel that was shrinking, past 311 names on a bulkhead that was drawing in, and she did not stop, because 31 people were holding a fire behind her with the last of 200 years of strength, and every second she cost them was a second they might not have. She reached the dorsal collar with the folded space failing at her heels, and threw herself through the airlock into the Meridian Lark. And the small, honest courier ship, unarmed, unglamorous, built for one purpose only, received her like a hand closing around a thing it meant to keep safe. She hit the comm board still gasping. The Lark was a courier. Its whole reason to exist was to carry a message to everyone at once, on every band to every soul in range. And it had the reach to touch Wind 9 and through Wind 9 the whole nervous listening concordance, and through the concordance the relay chain that ran, link by link across the light years, all the way home to Earth. Sela Marr, 26 years old, 3 years out of the academy, opened every channel her ship possessed, and she did the one thing a courier is for. She told the truth. She told them what she had found. She told them about the coffee kept warm for 2 centuries, and the star forged out of need, and the space folded around a promise, and the 31 souls who had kept a watch in the dark for 217 years, and never once let it drop. She told them about Dr. Sway, dead in the chapel bulkhead, who had understood that in the wound of the universe a need held clearly enough by enough people became a law the cosmos would bend to satisfy. She told them the ship was home and dying on the doorstep, that ordinary space did not believe in the fire that kept the crew alive, that 31 people could not outvote the whole indifferent universe alone. And then she told them the thing that Odell had sent her to say, the thing that was either the maddest words ever broadcast or the truest, and she found as she said it that she believed it with her whole heart. "I know how this sounds," she said, into every channel at once, to the station and the fleet and the distant listening worlds. "I know none of you can touch this ship. It's 2 days from the nearest of you and light years from Earth. But you don't have to touch it. That's not how the thing they made works. It works on need. On enough people needing the same thing clearly enough all at once that the universe rounds up. There are 31 people aboard this ship who have needed one thing for 200 years: to come home, to bring their crew home, every soul they could keep. They kept the promise so long it became real. But they can't hold it alone anymore out here where the rules are hard. So I'm asking you, all of you, everyone who can hear me. There's a monument on Earth with 311 names on it, and every one of you has wished at least once that the story had ended differently. It can. Right now it can. I need you to need them home. Not hope, not watch. Need it the way you'd need a rope you were hanging from to hold. All of you, all at once. Put your weight on it and do not let go." For a moment there was nothing but the hiss of the open channels and the failing ship groaning around her. And then one by one, and then in a flood, the galaxy answered. It began at Wen 9 because Wen 9 was nearest and had watched the ship appear out of empty sky. Oskosk the Thren, mild-mannered and patient, who had never in 140 years been surprised, sat in his observation blister and looked at the ancient human warship dying on his doorstep, and he found that he needed it to live. He did not decide to. It simply happened, the way the truest things do, and beside him the gray-shelled sea-thari scientist who had spent 2 centuries insisting on what was and was not possible looked at the guttering star on her instruments and set 2 centuries of caution aside and needed, with her whole scholarly heart, for the impossible thing to go on being impossible a little longer. The station's whole small council needed it, and their need, small as it was, 30 souls added to 31, was the first weight on the rope. It ran up the relay chain faster than it had any right to, because Sela's broadcast ran on a courier's priority bands, and a courier's bands reached everyone. It reached the human fleet, 2 days out, every hard-bitten spacer aboard every warship turning from their instruments to need a 200-year-old grave to become a homecoming. It reached the frontier settlements, the miners and the farmers and the diplomats, who had all walked past the monument as children. It reached the concordance worlds, the old careful species who had always found humans too loud and too young and too impossible, and who discovered, looking at the dying fire on their screens, that impossible was the very thing they had always secretly loved about this species and could not bear now to watch it fail. It reached at the far end of the chain across the light years, after a delay that in ordinary physics should have made it useless, and in the softened arithmetic of need made it only more true, the homeworld itself. It reached Earth, and on Earth, before the monument with 311 names, in the middle of an ordinary day, people began to gather, having heard, and to stand, and to need their long-lost warship home. Aboard the Perdita, at the rail around the dying star, Captain Yoni Odell felt it arrive. She would try, afterward, to describe it, and she would do no better than Sela had done with the ship. It came like a tide, like a current that had been running against them for 200 years, turning, all at once, to run with them. The rope in every crewman's chest that they had been holding alone against the whole weight of ordinary space went suddenly taut with other hands. 31 became 1,000, became 1,000,000, became a number too large to feel as anything but warmth, an ocean of need pouring in from a galaxy that had decided all at once that this ship would come home. The forged star, guttering, shrinking, dying, felt the universe stop leaning against it, felt the vote recounted, felt the arithmetic, so long and so cruelly against it, tip. and the little handmade sun at the heart of the Perdita, that 31 people had wanted into being in the dark and held against 2 centuries of the void, flared back to gold, and swelled and steadied and burned. Not because the laws of physics had been broken. Sela understood that later, when the physicists asked her 1,000 times what had happened and she gave them all the same answer. The laws had not been broken. They had been outvoted. There were more souls in that hour who needed the Perdita to live than there was cold, indifferent physics to say she could not, and so, for one impossible hour she lived, because a whole galaxy had put its weight on the rope and refused together to let go. The call of drift space did not thin any further. It held, and in its holding, the crew of the Perdita did the last thing there was to do. They did not fight to stay in the softened space. They let it go, gently, deliberately, the way you set down a weight when at last there are hands enough to take it. They eased the fire down out of the impossible and into the merely difficult. Chief Atero's forged star, no longer needing to be a miracle, consented at last to be a reactor. A contained fusion source, strange and unprecedented and studyable, that would burn on ordinary fuel under ordinary law now that ordinary law had a galaxy's blessing to let it. The folded space unfolded, kindly, releasing its extra room back to the universe, leaving the Perdita 400 meters long and 9 decks deep, and exactly, honestly, the size she had always been. The healed hull stopped being a want and became a scar, silver gray and permanent, a wound that a crew had closed with nothing but the refusal to come apart. And 31 souls, for the first time in 217 years, let go of the watch entirely, all at once, and did not fall because the galaxy had them. Sela Marr flew the Meridian Lark back to the Perdita's flank herself, by hand, because she did not trust the autopilot with something she loved, and she watched through the forward window as the ancient warship steadied in the dark and turned, for the first time in 217 years, to face inward toward the settled worlds instead of outward toward the wound that had swallowed her. The star still breathed. She could see its light now through the healed seam of the hull, no longer the deep ember red of a fire going out but a steady, honest gold, the color of a hearth that someone had decided would not be allowed to die. The ship no longer felt asleep. She felt awake. She felt, absurdly and exactly, relieved, the way a person feels when they set down a burden at the end of a road so long they had stopped believing the road had an end. At Wen 9, the observation blister was crowded, and no one in it was working. Oskosk the Thren stood with all 4 of his hands pressed flat against the viewport, watching the impossible ship, and he was weeping in the way of his people, which is to say silently, his throat working, and he did not care who saw. The Sithari scientist stood beside him with 2 centuries of certainties lying in ruins around her feet, and she was not mourning them. She was smiling. She had spent her whole long life proving what could not be, and a 200-year-old human warship had just proven her wrong about all of it, and she found, to her own astonishment, that being wrong in this direction was the finest thing that had ever happened to her. "Signal the Concordance Council," she told the blister, without turning from the window. "Tell them to stop drafting quarantine orders. Tell them we are not quarantining anything. Tell them a human warship has come home from the dead, and we are going to stand here and watch it dock, and every instrument I command is going to record every second of it, because our children's children will not believe us otherwise." She wiped her eyes with a gray-shelled hand. "And tell them one more thing. Tell them the humans were right about the thing we always held against them. They never do accept the odds. We called it recklessness for 200 years. I think we were wrong about that too." Aboard the Perdita, the crew stood watch over their steadied star, and for the first time in 2 centuries no one strained. They simply tended it, the way you tend a fire you mean to keep, and one by one they came off the catwalks and went to the forward compartments and looked out through the ports at a sky with real stars in it, ordinary stars, catalogued and named and burning under laws they could trust, and at the small bright ring of Wen 9 hanging in the middle distance with a whole species crowded against its windows to watch them come. Okonkwo, who had been born aboard and had never in her life seen a real sky, stood at the largest port with her hands flat against the cold glass, and she looked at the stars she had only ever seen in a crayon drawing, and she did not say anything at all. There was nothing to say. She had needed this her whole life, needed it clearly enough to help hold a ship together across the dark, and now it was simply, quietly, ordinarily true, the way the largest things are when they finally arrive. Behind her, Reyes put a hand on her shoulder and Halloran on the other, and the three of them stood and looked at the sky, and the star burned steady and gold at the ship's heart, and the promise, kept for 217 years and handed off 10,000 times without once being dropped, was finally done. The fleet arrived 30 hours later to find a 200-year-old warship holding station beside a courier cutter, both of them whole, both of them warm, and a young lieutenant asleep at last in her acceleration couch with the comm board still lit on every channel. What they found aboard the Perdita would occupy the Concordance's scientists for the rest of their careers and their children's careers after them. A reactor that ran on principles no one could reproduce, forged by dead hands in a place where physics had been negotiable. A hull scar of a material that existed in no catalog and could not be made again outside the wound of the universe. Sealed logs spanning 2 centuries in the strange arithmetic of the drift. Every instrument they brought aboard returned readings that defied the science that had built the instrument, and the scientists argued for a generation about what any of it meant, and never fully agreed, and that was right, because some of it was never meant to be understood. Some of it was only ever meant to be survived. But that came later. On the day itself, when the fleet's boarding parties came aboard with their reverence and their scanners, what they found first, standing at the airlock waiting to receive them in mended 200-year-old uniforms, was 31 human beings and their captain, alive, whole, home. Yoni Odell surrendered her ship to the senior admiral with the formality of a navy 2 centuries gone, and the admiral, a hard old spacer who had cried perhaps twice in his life, could not get through the acknowledgement without stopping. And when the formalities were done, Captain Odell went and found the young courier pilot who had come when she was nearest, who had boarded a breathing ship alone, who had understood in 1 hour what the physicists would miss for a generation, that the miracle was never the star, but the promise, not the physics, but the refusal to let go, and who had thought to bring 3 trillion strangers in to keep the last watch. They will ask you for the rest of your life how it was done, Odell said. And you will tell them the truth, and they will write it down as physics, because that is the only language they have. But you and I know what it was, Lieutenant Marr. You held a watch you had no training for, in a place you had no business being, because someone needed you and you were nearest. That is the whole of it. That is the only law that was ever really operating aboard this ship. She took Sela's hand in both of her scarred ones. 311 souls went into the dark. 217 years we kept the promise, and in the end it was kept the last meter by a child in a courier ship who needed us home. Thank you, Lieutenant. Thank you for keeping the watch. They would spend a generation cataloging the impossibilities of the returned warship Perdita, the forge that made a star, the metal that healed, the space that folded, the clocks that lied, the coffee kept warm for 2 centuries against every law that said it could not be. Every artifact aboard defied the science that came to study it, and the scientists never stopped marveling, and they were right to marvel. But Sela Marr, who had walked those breathing decks alone and held the last watch with a galaxy at her back, knew the answer under all the answers, and she carried it quietly for the rest of her long life. Everything aboard that ship defied science for one reason only, because 31 human beings, lost in a wound in the universe, had refused to die, refused to let go, and refused to break a promise to the person on the next watch, and had needed to come home so clearly, and so long and so together, that in the end the universe itself agreed to let them.